Morning, everybody. Again, thanks to Kavita and Deepa for this opportunity. Um, our work involves modeling and simulations of HIV and hepatitis C virus infections with the goal of attempting to see if strategies can be devised that might improve our ability to combat these infectious diseases. Today, I'll tell you some recent work on understanding the evolutionary arms race between HIV and human populations that we have done. All of our work is associated with within-host evolution. So at the population level, we always look at populations of cells within an infected individual. Some of this work has relationships to a lot of things that Nishit spoke about, and I'll motivate those connections as we go along. Let me begin with a very quick introduction to HIV, and then I'll step into the problem that we're looking at. This is just a map showing the prevalence of HIV today, a few years ago. About 33 million people are infected. These colors show the percentages of the people in the different parts of the world that are infected and living with HIV. It's a pretty global phenomena. With billions of dollars spent, we still don't have vaccines and drugs. And we have drugs, but they can't cure the infection completely. So these are the motivations for some of the studies that we undertake. What exactly is HIV? I want to delve a little bit into the virus and its life cycle. For that involves some of the studies that we're going to look at subsequently. This is a cartoon of the virus. It contains 2 copies of its genomic material in the form of RNA strands. It has a bunch of proteins that are involved in its structure. This virus infects cells of our immune system called CD4 positive T cells. Once inside these cells, the virus hijacks the cellular replication machinery and forces the cell to produce many thousands of copies of itself. These blue dots here are new viral particles that are coming out of this infected cell. So in the process, this cell is overwhelmed and it dies. These viral particles are then released. They go on and infect other cells, and this cycle continues. This is how disease progresses in the body of a typical infected individual. On the y-axis are shown 2 markers of disease progression in arbitrary scales. On the x-axis is the time following the onset of infection. In red here are the concentrations of these cells that get infected by the virus, and in blue are the concentrations of the viral particles. So once you get infection, these viral levels rise. These cell counts, because they are infected and they die, drop. At this point, an immune response is mounted. This controls this virus replication, so the viral levels drop. These cell levels then rise, but then the virus doesn't get completely eliminated by the body's immune mechanism. It reaches what is called as a viral set point. At this point, a person is chronically infected. This set point lasts for a very long time, maybe many years. Notice the change of scale here. At which point, these cell counts, which are gradually dropping, reach perilously low levels that the body's immune system is severely compromised. These viral populations then rise dramatically, causing a condition that we recognize as AIDS. Here, the individual succumbs to opportunistic infections. This chronic infection stage is an interesting case. Most people present themselves to the clinic for treatment in this particular phase. Here, although the population looks constant, what's changing is the character of this population. And that's particularly characterized by this quantity called the diversity. That's shown here in cartoon representation by the different colors of these viral particles. During this period of chronic infection, the viral diversity continuously changes. Eventually, the body, of course, responds to this evolution of diversity by mounting a more and more diverse immune response. But eventually, at this point, the diversity of the viral population is thought to be so large that the immune system can no longer keep up with this increasing diversity and then succumbs. So this is how one apparently presumes the transition to AIDS comes about. So it's this business that we call now the evolutionary arms race. The virus is evolving, the immune system is evolving as well in response to the evolution of this virus, and each is trying to outpace the other. It's also this evolution of the virus that is responsible for the failure of a whole bunch of drugs. So how does this evolution take place, and how it influences the failure of drugs is what I'll describe in the next 1 or 2 slides. For that, I'll have to go into the virus life cycle very quickly. So this is a snapshot of the virus life cycle. Here is the virus. It attaches to the surface of a cell. This bottom portion is a cartoon of a cell which this virus will infect. It attaches here through binding of its surface proteins. The viral genomic content is let inside. RNA then this is the genomic content in the form of RNA strands. It's converted in a step called reverse transcription to DNA. This DNA is then transported into the nucleus. It gets integrated here. This then is now read off into many, many new viral RNA copies. These copies are translated also into viral proteins. The proteins and the viral genomic content are assembled and released as new viral particles. Our drugs target many of these steps in the viral replication cycle, try and abort these and control virus replication. It's this step, though, of reverse transcription where a lot of the viral evolution takes place. Mutations and recombination take place. So two steps, two processes are involved. The first, of course, is mutation. So here, for example, is a cartoon of a viral genomic strand. The 4 colors, let's say, represent the 4 nucleotides. And this now is the progeny viral strand that's produced after reverse transcription. These positions here that are highlighted in these boxes are places where mutations have taken place. It turns out that the population of infected cells in our body is very large. Each of these viral particles that infects these cells undergoes these mutations randomly, and therefore a very large diverse population of viral particles comes out after every generation of such replication events. The second step, of course, is recombination. So here, for example, are the 2 viral RNA strands that are present inside one viral particle. When this collection of strands is inside an infected cell, this enzyme called reverse transcriptase, shown here with a pink dot, when it reads off this RNA into DNA, it shuffles templates from one RNA strand to another stochastically. This then produces a mosaic strand that contains portions of this and this strand. This is now the reverse transcription. Reverse transcriptase driven evolution of diversity. So you can see, for example, here that if this strand has a mutation at this position and this one has a mutation at this position, this particular sequence of template switching events produces this DNA that has these mutations accumulated. So this also is another process by which diversity can be accelerated. Again, there is a lot of evidence that a huge amount of reverse transcription does take place, recombination does take place with HIV. Here, for example, is an experiment where template switching events have been recorded. Every switch in color from yellow to blue is a template switch event, and one horizontal bar is one reverse transcription step. So on average, people find that about 10 crossovers take place every reverse transcription. So there's a huge amount of recombination taking place. As a consequence of this, of course, you have now altered genomes and therefore altered protein structures, and these alterations in protein structures are responsible for drug resistance. Shown here, for example, is a cartoon of this process of drug resistance. Here is now protein of the virus against which this drug has been designed. This drug is thought is designed to get into this pocket of this virus and block its activity. But because of these mutations, subtle changes in the structures of these proteins can arise, which then block the access of this drug to this active pocket and therefore cause the drug to fail. So this is the process of drug resistance. This is how all of the drugs that we have so far succumb to failure because of viral evolution-driven resistance. And this problem has become so acute that people have made cartoons about it. And they say in this cartoon that you're right, no, it's wearing a red cape and blue tie. It's now a new superbug. So the question, of course, has been how does one overcome this general limitation of viral evolution-driven resistance? More fundamentally, how does one think about this evolutionary arms race between the viruses and us? What I want to do here, so one would have thought, if you wanted to control this or tilt this evolutionary arms race in one way, one strategy would be to see if you could restrict viral mutation rates so that this dramatic evolution that gives rise to resistance would be controlled. If one looks at the body's mechanisms in trying to do that, of course, the body is trying to do that in many ways, but then there's a very peculiar protein that our host cells manufacture that influences the viral mutation rate in exactly this the opposite way. It tries to increase the viral mutation rates. And I'll talk about this protein that brings a new twist in my assessment to this tail of this evolutionary arms race. So that protein was discovered in 2002, has been called ApoBec. This protein is a protein that's produced in response to interferon signaling. Interferon signaling happens every time our body is infected by a virus. So let's say the cell here now is infected by HIV, and this HIV is being now copied inside the cell. Inside this cell, interferon signaling happens and produces this molecule called ApoBex3G, which I will abbreviate as A3G. This A3G molecule is incorporated in budding viruses. When this virus now that contains this molecule A3G gets inside another cell and causes an infection, during this process of reverse transcription, this molecule A3G introduces a huge number of mutations. So it's actually increasing mutations in this process of reverse transcription. So what it does is it looks at, so if this is the parent strand, and this is the strand that comes out after this ApoBec acts on the strand, it converts a large number of these GG dinucleotide motifs into AGs. In fact, the frequency of these mutations is so large that they've been termed hypermutations. About 10% or so of these GGs get converted to AGs. What is observed is that as a consequence of these hypermutations, the level of viral infection dramatically drops. So here you're now asking the opposite question. Here's our own host mechanism trying to deal with these viruses by not reducing the viral mutation rates, but actually increasing them dramatically. The virus, this mechanism is so powerful that the virus has devised an exclusive mechanism to deal with this onslaught of the host. So the virus has a protein called VIF, which is also now produced when this translation of viral RNA takes place. This VIF binds to A3G and targets it for proteasomal degradation. So now as a result, there's not enough ApoBec left in this cell. So there's not ApoBec that's getting incorporated in budding viral particles. These viral particles can then go back, infect other cells, experience reverse transcription without these hypermutations. So the viral genome appears, therefore, to be much more conserved than in the presence of this ApoBec. And when this happens, it's been shown that viral infectivity is maintained. So this factor, this protein has therefore been called the viral infectivity factor. So here now, you're seeing this evolutionary arms race play out in quite the opposite way. The host is increasing the viral mutation rates, and the virus is trying to suppress this ability of the host to increase the viral mutation rate. So when this kind of an interaction is seen, you naturally want to intervene there, right? Because you hope that if you can block this interaction, you would free up ApoBec to do whatever it is supposed to do, and therefore suppress this particular sustainability of infection. This is indeed being pursued. ApoBec3G VIF interaction is an attractive drug target. There are now candidate drugs that are being developed that would either stabilize or upregulate ApoBec inside infected cells or antagonize the interaction of VIF with ApoBec. So if this would happen, you would block this interaction and therefore allow ApoBec to induce hypermutations and control viral replication. So the question then is now, if this were indeed the process, you could ask, what exactly is ApoBec doing? Suppose I block this interaction, what would I achieve? How does ApoBec go about suppressing viral replication? What is this increase in mutation rates doing? So that's the question that we were after. One obvious answer would be from what Nishit has suggested, that this would increase the mutation rate effectively of the virus and therefore potentially drive it past its error catastrophe or error threshold. So that's a possibility. You could induce an error catastrophe, which means that you drive the mutation rate so high that there is an induced loss of genetic information, and that suppresses viral replication. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, if you look a little carefully at the way ApoBec acts, is the following, that it could actually induce nonsense mutations. So here's what happens. If I look at this particular strand, where I have all these GG motifs being converted by ApoBec into AG, you'll find that a particular codon, TGG, for tryptophan, can actually get converted to a stop codon. And there's growing evidence that this now suppresses viral production. It turns out if you scan the HIV-1 genome, that there are about 100 such TGG sites where these hypermutations can potentially induce these stop codons. So the chance that you miss all of those 100 sites in any one reverse transcription step is very, very small. And therefore, there's a belief now that ApoBec acts in more or less an all or nothing manner. If you have ApoBec, you definitely induce these stop codons, and you definitely bring down viral replication. If you don't have them, you just can't bring about this effect. And there is also now experimental evidence that the more you have of these hypermutations, the fewer of the viral genomes that are produced, both at the DNA level as well as the viral RNA level. So this is the other possibility, that these nonsense mutations are being induced that suppress viral production and therefore compromise the sustainability of this infection generation after generation. Which of these two processes is actually going on? And that has implications for this intervention strategy. Why? It will tell us how much of this drug we must use, or in other words, how much of the ApoBec-WIF interaction we must block. The second implication is actually a little more profound. If this were indeed the activity that was going on, here you will realize that suboptimal increases in the mutation rate will drive a tremendous increase in viral diversity that compromises our immune system and also other drugs that might be used in conjunction. Here, you recognize that what you're doing is actually suppressing viral production and not necessarily driving mutation rates up as much. So diversity is not really being driven up in this strategy. So you can more liberally use drugs if this were what was going on. So how do we tease apart what's going on? First of all, we must first check. So let me ask the questions that we are after if we were to tease apart these phenomena. First of all, does an error threshold exist for HIV? If yes, what is it? So after listening to Nishit, this question doesn't seem as outlandish anymore. Right? So one must first establish that there is indeed an error threshold. Second, if that were indeed true, does ApoBec drive HIV past this error threshold? Third, if I intervene at the ApoBec-WIF axis, can I prevent whatever phenomena WIF is involved in so that ApoBec gets freed up to do whatever it is doing? So these are the questions. So how do we think about an error threshold for HIV? So the classic case would be to go back to the quasi-species theory, which of course Nishit has so nicely described for us. It looks at error-prone self-replicating molecules evolving on this L-dimensional unit hypercube through a mutation selection process. And when you solve this at stationary state in a deterministic setting, you predict the existence of an error threshold. Many metrics can be used. For example, if you look at quantifying the amount of genetic information contained in this viral quasi-species using Shannon entropies, which are defined by this quantity where Xi's are the frequencies of the different kinds of genomes that you might have, then the Shannon entropy at this point of the error threshold will switch from being heavily localized around the fittest or the master sequence to something that's equally distributed on the sequence space. So you get this transition. The question, of course, is this is a prediction of the quasi-species theory, and we've all heard in the previous talk that it doesn't necessarily apply to finite populations. So does it apply really to HIV? What's the difference between what quasi-species theory considers and what happens in HIV? Several differences. The key ones are listed here. First is that the quasi-species theory assumes that the individuals in that replicating milieu are haploid. HIV is diploid. Quasi-species theory assumes asexual reproduction, whereas in the case of HIV, as I just demonstrated, there's rampant recombination. And the last is, of course, this classic difference of the population size. Quasi-species theory assumes a deterministic process that drives this evolution, whereas in HIV, the effective population size can be rather small. So what this is telling us is that you can't really apply quasi-species theory to HIV. So one would, in principle, like to adapt and extend quasi-species theory ideas to the case of HIV, but that is really hard, and Nishit will testify to it. You cannot think of, at least as of now, constructing a formal theory that accounts for all of these effects and predict an error catastrophe or a threshold. That hasn't been done. So we resorted to simulations. So I'll describe to you in the next few slides what these simulations are and what we find from them. So simulations try to mimic how the viral population evolves in the body of an infected individual using a Wright-Fisher type process, discrete generations, synchronous infections, and so on. Each cycle of our simulations involves 5 steps, and I'll describe those 5 steps to you in a little more detail. The first is viral pool generation, then infection of reverse transcription, where all the evolution takes place. Then you produce progeny viral particles, and these then experience fitness selection, and this cycle then continues. So let me go through these steps one by one. So to produce viruses, we first generate a random collection of nucleotides of length equal to roughly the genomic length of HIV. We then copy this genome in pairs in V0 viral particles, which form the initial pool of viruses. In this population now, we assume a fraction A of these viruses will contain ApoBec. This fraction is also chosen randomly. This collection of viral particles now infects C0 target cells. This is now the initial collection of target cells. Each cell it gets infected by M viral particles. This M is drawn from a distribution that's been measured experimentally. Inside these infected cells, reverse transcription takes place. So you look at each collection of these viral particles and first recombine them. Here recombination happens with a template switching probability of rho per site. This is also measured, so we know these probabilities. Then we mutate. This now produces a recombined genome, which then experiences both mutations and hypermutations. Mutations, as Nishit pointed out, we assume happen independently and with a fixed probability mu per site per reverse transcription. And hypermutations happen according to this double peak probability, which has also been measured experimentally. So there's a position dependence of this hypermutation rate, which we incorporate in our model. For hypermutations, of course, we check whether these GG dinucleotide motifs exist, and if they do exist, then we mutate those GGs with this particular probability. And we also ask if at certain positions these mutations result in stop codons. So this is now the evolution of these genomes that takes place. We then produce viruses. For producing viruses, we randomly assort proviruses that are produced after this mutation, recombination, hypermutation process, assemble them in pairs and release them as new viral particles, each cell producing P different viral particles. These viruses then, again, we assume contain ApoBec in about a fraction A of the total viral population. This is again also random. These viral particles are now subjected to fitness selection. This fitness selection now happens in two steps. The first is we look at whether these viral particles have stop codons. If they have stop codons, they're not really functional. They can't do much, so they're selected out. From the remaining viral particles, we then look at the collection of mutations that has been accumulated in each virus. And fortunately for us, some approximate fitness landscape for HIV has been measured, and we use that fitness landscape. This audience doesn't need re-emphasizing that the fitness landscape is crucial. This is now an experimental fitness landscape that looks at relative replicative ability of viral genomes that have different numbers of mutations. And fortunately, you find a Hamming class scaling in this fitness landscape. So the fitness now depends only, it turns out fortunately, on the number of mutations that these genomes contain relative to the fittest or the wild type, and not on the specific combination of mutations. So that simplifies for us this simulation quite a bit. So we use this to our advantage and then subject these viral particles to fitness selections. Some of these then are dropped out because of this selection, and the rest now form the new collection of viral particles for the next generation of infection. And this process continues. So we repeat this process many generations, and for many such realizations of our simulations, and ask what the diversity of the viral populations is going to look like, and what mutation rates will drive us to an error catastrophe, if at all. So first, let's look at what happens if you do not have any ApoBecs in there. So no intervention at the ApoBec VIF axis, etc. No hypermutations are taking place. We look at a small genome length initially, just to understand these simulations, a small cell population size, and an artificially high mutation rate so that you speed up evolution. What is shown here is the frequency of genomes as a function of Hamming class. So all the genomes that have the same number of mutations will belong to a particular Hamming class. And these colors now depict the distribution of these genomes at in different generations following the start of the simulation. So initially, of course, all our genomes are identical. We assume they are the fittest ones. So you have a delta function at 0. With time, mutations accumulate, so you develop a tail in this distribution. Higher mutants begin to grow. And as this evolution progresses, you start to see this distribution shift to the right to higher and higher Hamming classes. But eventually, you reach now a stationary distribution. So this stationary distribution is the average, time average, of all of the quasi-species structures that we have after a particular number of generations, which initially we did not realize, but then now we do realize has to be at least log n, whatever, larger than the system size. So you now have this quasi-species structure. This is now for a particular mutation rate. In terms of the Shannon entropy also, we see now that the Shannon entropy rises and then eventually reaches a plateau that corresponds to the entropy that's contained in this particular quasi-species. Then we ask what happens to this quasi-species distribution as the mutation rate is increased. So when you increase the mutation rate, what you find is, as expected, the quasi-species now shifts to larger and larger Hamming classes. But interestingly, there's a sharp transition that happens from a quasi-species that's localized to, on low Hamming classes to one that's localized on much larger Hamming classes. In fact, localized around L by 2. The L is 200, so you'll see this peaking around L by 2. In this particular case, this transition seems to happen around 5 times 10 to the power minus 3. This transition will become even more evident when the genome length is much larger. So in this case, we have a much larger length of 1000, and you will see now that there's this dramatic transition that takes place when you go from mutation rates of around 7.3 to 7.5. So you jump from a quasi-species that's localized around the master sequence to one that is completely now randomly distributed in sequence space. Again, using Shannon entropies, you find that this Shannon entropy now goes up from somewhere close to 0, small number, to 1, telling us that all of the information, at least according to this metric, has now been lost. So this is indicative of the error catastrophe that Eigen predicted. We do see that if we use realistic parameters for HIV, that you do get this kind of a transition. How does this apply to HIV? These are all, of course, artificial parameters and so on. So we set up simulations that would, first of all, take us closer to experimental data. So fortunately for us, the diversity and divergence evolution as a function of time has been measured in about 9 or 10 patients in careful detail. Each panel here shows data from one patient. These symbols are experimental observations. Purple ones are divergence, and these cyan ones are diversity. Divergence tells us how removed a particular population is at any given point in time from the founder sequences, and diversity tells us how diverse the population is at any given point in time within itself. These lines now are best fits of our simulations to this data. What we've adjusted is the effective population size, or the population size C in our simulations, and the viral generation time. In all cases, what you find, first of all, is that our simulations are able to capture these observations reasonably well. These generation times are indeed very close to the generation times that have been observed for HIV in other experiments. And these population sizes are also consistent with other estimates of the effective population size of HIV. The population sizes, as we heard in yesterday's talk, are much lower than the census population size. And there are many reasons for that. One of them being that in at least these simulations, we have ignored the immune system completely. So if you did, you perhaps would get much larger population size. Nonetheless, with this system, we at least capture the evolution of diversity and divergence that's observed in patients. So we have some confidence now in our system and the parameters that we've been using. We can now ask whether there is an error threshold that exists for HIV and what that error threshold would be. So we now redid our simulations with full-length genomes, with the population sizes spanning the ranges that we estimated from comparisons with patient data, the right mutation, recombination rates, etc., etc. And we asked what happens now to Shannon entropy as a function of the mutation rate. So you find, interestingly, that at around a mutation rate that's roughly equal to 1 over the length, as Eigen's quasi-species was predicting, you find the sharp transition that marks the onset of an error catastrophe. And what we find is that the error threshold is roughly 2 to 6-fold larger than the natural mutation rate of HIV. Many may ask what happens if this estimate of the effective population size were wrong, because the census population size of HIV is very large. We find, interestingly, that this error threshold exhibits this 1 over root n kind of scaling that Nishit alluded to. We find the scaling robust. We have done this in other simulations as well with smaller system sizes and much more detailed calculations. Why the scaling comes up is something that we still don't understand, but it's there. But it's telling us, fortunately, that the error threshold will not rise too far above this error threshold as you increase the population size. So we have some kind of a bound on what this upper bound on what this error threshold would be. That's the upper bound. Anyway, it tells us that the natural mutation rate of HIV is not very far below this error threshold. It's about a factor of 2 to 6 lower than this number. So it's telling us, first of all, that the virus has optimized perhaps its mutation rate so that it's just close to this error threshold. So it's maximizing its diversity without suffering loss of genetic information. Secondly, it's hopeful in terms of intervention strategies, because then with a small increase in the mutation rate, you might actually drive this virus past the error catastrophe. What does ApoBec do? Suppose you intervened now at the ApoBec-WIF axis. Would you actually trigger an error catastrophe? That's the question. So we now did those simulations. Repeat these exact simulations now with increasing values of A, which is the fraction of viral particles that contains ApoBec. If you think of intervening at the ApoBec-WIF axis, the greater the intervention, the larger would be the population or the fraction of viruses that would contain ApoBec. And here's what we find. This is now the population of infected cells in different generations, normalized to the population, by the population at the start, as a function of the number of generations. When this A goes up from about 0 to 0.75, this population doesn't change at all. It's just where it was initially. So you have now an established persistent infection. Interestingly, when you go up, you increase this fraction to about 0.8 or larger, you see this dramatic drop in the population of infected cells, eventually reaching 0. So you see this again, a sharp transition as this fraction A goes up from about 0.75 to 0.8 or 0.81. So 0.81 perhaps is this critical fraction of viral particles that must contain ApoBec for this infection process to be rendered unsustainable. This is good. We at least now have an understanding of how much intervention is good enough. We still don't know, though, what this intervention is doing. Is it triggering an error catastrophe? So we can look at the structure of the quasi-species as you go through this transition and ask whether the quasi-species structure is being driven away from one that's localized on the master sequence to one that's completely dispersed in sequence space. So here's what we find. This is now this is now the quasi-species structure as you traverse this transition. A of 0.75, A of 0.8, 0.81 is where we saw the transition in the previous slide. And you see now that the quasi-species, first of all, the quasi-species has a bimodal distribution. This we understand because the viral population that you look at, or this is now the quasi-species based on the proviral DNA, you find that some of these viral particles don't have ApoBec in them, and therefore they don't suffer hypermutation. These have ApoBec in them, and they suffer hypermutation. So you'll always have these two populations where one has fewer mutations than the other, because this one will have now hypermutations that ApoBec induces. So you get this bimodal distribution. But what's interesting is that you don't find this distribution shifting at all as you cross this transition. If error catastrophe were the phenomena that were driving the loss of viability of that infection, you would have seen this distribution jump very close to the completely randomized distribution that you would have seen after you cross the error threshold. Notice the change or the break in the axis here. So you are completely localized while infection is being rendered unsustainable. So this is now not an error catastrophe that this ApoBec is inducing. That's what we learn from at least this. So what is ApoBec doing? How is the sustainability being compromised? It must be the stop codons, right? That's why those stop codons are compromising the ability of the virus to produce new viral particles. So we checked, first of all, using a very simple population genetics type model, whether we can reproduce this transition limit by recognizing that stop codons block viral production. So the idea is the following. This is a very simple model. You think of all the viruses, all the cells that are infected by viruses in an etah generation. These will then produce viral particles. Some of these viral particles will have ApoBec in them, and these will then go on to infect the next generation of cells via fitness selection, etc., etc. Now, for this infection to be viable, this population must be at least as much as this. If A is too large, then you have enough of these particles not being infectious enough that this number will start dropping. So we can ask what this critical value is for this system to have sustained infection. Very crude arguments now, very simple models. So here's the basic model that we constructed. Here's a cell that, let's say, has m viral particles in them. This m follows a distribution that perhaps could be measured experimentally. For example, you could have 77% of the cells being singly infected, 20% doubly, etc., etc. You look at this cell and ask, when you have these m viral particles, you pick one of these viral strands and ask whether this viral strand has a stop codon or not. So if I define R as the probability that this genome does not have a stop codon, I can write this probability R as 1 minus A, which is the probability that the viral particle that brought in this genome did not contain ApoBec. Then you wouldn't get these stop codons. Or it did have ApoBec, but then ApoBec somehow missed all of the TGG sites and did not induce any, stochastically did not induce any stop codons. So that probability I can write as Q. That Q we can get from knowing the mutation probability and the locations of the stop codon sites, and that's simply the product of not having any of these mutations, any of these sites be converted into stop codons. That's a straightforward probability. So once I know the probability that a particular genome is not going to have a stop codon, I can then define another random number, random variable x, as the number of genomes inside this particular cell that does not have stop codons in them. So this is then simply now a Bernoulli trial. So I get this probability. Now I look at the viral particles that are produced from this cell. Those viral particles that would select both their viral genomes not to have stop codons will then be fit. They contribute to the infection in subsequent generation. So I ask, what's the total population of viruses that's coming out from cells of this particular generation that don't have stop codons in them? So what's the chance that I pick both genomes that don't have stop codons at just x by m? So I sum over all of this probability distribution and over the number of cells that is infected in the eta generation. P is the number of viral particles that is produced. So this is the population that's produced that does not have stop codons. This would have infected the next generation of cells, except that it would be truncated by the fitness selection that we brought about through mutations that were not responsible for stop codons. There was a general drop in fitness as you accumulated mutations. So if I assume that a fraction f of these viral particles would then be able to infect the next generation, that would give me the viable viral particles that are produced from this generation. And if I say on average, you produce these many cells infected in the next generation, where m is now the average number of infections per cell, then you have some description of what the number of cells is that is infected in the next generation. For extinction, this number must equal the number that I began with. So that gives me some criteria for sustainability. So if I do the algebra, some straightforward algebra there, I get an expression for AC. This is the critical fraction of cells that must contain ApoBec for infection not to be sustainable. And when I plug in the numbers, here's what I find. Of course, I don't know what this F is, the average fitness, how many particles will survive fitness selection. So what I do, just to check my simulations, is go back to my quasi-species structure and recognize that this initial peak is the one that does not contain ApoBec in them. So the average fitness of this peak is what will be the fraction of genomes that will survive fitness selection. This is just lost because of stop codons. So I pull out this average just because I know the quasi-species structure, stick that in, I know all of the other parameters, and I can compute now what this critical fraction is, and it comes out bang to be 0.81. So it's at least validating my simulation, telling me that the actual mechanism that's driving this extinction is this ApoBec-induced stop codons that suppress viral production. This is good as a self-consistency check. How applicable is it in real life? There's another parallel to this particular description that draws from models of viral dynamics. So what you're doing now is rendering a certain fraction of these viral particles unviable by inducing stop codons. This is also the phenomena that was thought about when drugs were introduced, and the following question was asked: how much drug should one use so that you prevent infection of cells if you don't worry about mutations, etc. each cell produces a certain number of viral particles. These viral particles go on and infect other cells, and in this way, infection blows up. If on average a drug were able to block viral production or infection to the point where from each cell the number of viral particles released was such that less than one new cell were infected, then infection would die out. So this quantity from epidemiology is the basic reproductive number. So you ask now, what is the basic reproductive number of HIV in a host, and ask if ApoBec, for example, intervention here, could drive this basic reproductive number below 1. What would that critical ApoBec fraction be? So that's a simple calculation. Here is what happens now. You have infected cells in the body. They produce viral particles. These viral particles go and infect other cells, which in turn become infected, and this cycle continues. When you have ApoBec, a certain fraction of these A will now contain ApoBec, and these will now be rendered incapable of infecting other cells. Yes? Yeah, I'm almost done. Yeah. So this is now the fraction that continues to be infectious. If you set up now model equations, this is now a very famous model called the basic model of viral dynamics. It has described how populations of viral particles change as a function of time during therapy and so on quantitatively. So all of the parameters involved in this model are known. You know, for example, the infection rate, the viral production rate, etc., etc. All of that is known. So you can solve this model and ask now, and also from this you can extract the basic reproductive number, and you ask now what A should be for this basic reproductive number to drop below 1. R0 is this number before intervention at the ApoBec-VIF axis, and this then is the critical value that will tell you that if your fractions are larger than this number, your infection would go extinct. R0 is indeed the number of new infections produced by one infected cell. This can be measured experimentally. So there are estimates now of this R0 value from patients. Recent estimates are around 6 to 8. So when you stick these numbers in, you again get AC to be about 0.83 to 0.875, very close to the 0.81 that we obtained. There's one more piece of evidence that's suggesting to us that this number is right. That is the following. It's been observed in vitro that each viral particle that has, in the presence of functional VIF, contains about 0.3 to 0.8 ApoBec units per virus. Now, if we were to go back to the all or nothing mode of ApoBec action, what would the virus do if it were to deal with ApoBec? For example, this ApoBec, many people believe, is also beneficial to the virus because it can increase viral diversity, produces mutations and so on. So to some extent, it's good. But you also don't want this ApoBec to be so potent that it induces this drop in viral infection sustainability. So what would this virus do? It would want ApoBec incorporation, but at the population level to a point where it's just below this particular threshold. So if that were the case, you would again find that the number of ApoBec units per virus should on average be less than this particular threshold. And what we find is indeed that you don't cross this threshold in the number of ApoBec molecules that's seen incorporated in viral particles in the presence of fully functional VIF. So VIF is actually tuning the amount of ApoBec incorporation in viruses such that it maximizes the increase in diversity that ApoBec can produce without compromising its sustainability. That's the hypothesis. But at least it's another check of this number. So you could conclude in principle here that HIV is surviving not only on the brink of an era catastrophe, but also on the brink of an extinction catastrophe induced by ApoBec. So that's the end of my talk. Here's my summary. HIV survives on the brink of an era catastrophe because the error threshold is about 2 to 6 fold lower than the natural mutation rate. And also I should have added on the brink of an extinction catastrophe. You have now this critical number, roughly 81% of viruses that must contain ApoBec for ApoBec with interactions to be blocked potently enough that this infection can be rendered unsustainable. We do show how this intervention would act, not by inducing an era catastrophe, but by suppressing viral production through stop codons. And this is the other hypothesis, that VIF activity may have been evolutionarily optimized, that it curtails aquatic incorporation just to the optimum, where you maximize diversity but don't compromise sustainability. So with that, I must thank all of the students who've done this work. A lot of stimulating discussions and inputs from Nishit, and also making sure that we don't stray away from the path of mathematical